Welcome back, deep divers. We're about to wade into some pretty deep waters today, exploring the history and the science of influencing the human mind.
Yeah, this is a topic that's both, well, fascinating and kind of unsettling, isn't it? I mean, the idea that we can shape what people think, it's powerful stuff.
You know, it really is, and you sent me a ton of articles and research on this. A lot of it focuses on this very human desire to, well, to kind of control consciousness.
Both on an individual level, right?
Yeah.
One person influencing another, but also on a much bigger scale, like trying to influence entire groups or even societies.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking everything from ancient priests and shamans to modern day intelligence agencies and, these so-called psychotropic technologies. We're going to try to make sense of all of it in this deep dive.
We should probably say up front, though, this stuff can get pretty complicated, but we do our best to make it clear and hopefully really engaging.
Absolutely. No jargon overload, I promise. But, get ready for some mind-blowing moments.
All right, so let's start at the beginning. I mean, way back in history. You see, even in ancient times, people had an intuitive understanding of how to use influence.
Yeah, you see it with priests, elders, shamans, those figures who were, I guess you could say, the original people guides. They had this almost instinctive grasp of how to work with the human mind.
And the methods they used were, well, they were sensory. They used words, images, music, smells, even touch, all very deliberately.
It's like they understood at a deep level that what we experience through our senses can shape what we believe and how we act. And the reverence for astrologers, not just stargazers, but like the Chaldean mathematicians, the Magi. It wasn't just about predicting the future, right? It was tied to this ancient magic, this, what do they call it, Trinognesia.
Black magic, basically. Secret knowledge passed down very carefully, only to a select few. Knowledge was power, even back then.
And, the fairy tales, the Skoski, the idea that these stories could be part of something bigger, like conspiracies, it really shows the power they attributed to words, to language itself.
Right, it's like the energy of the words, the very act of speaking or telling a story had this almost magical power to shape reality.
It's a completely different way of looking at the world than we do now. Back then, everything was connected. Life, knowledge, religion, nature, it was all part of one big whole.
And that connection to nature, it was so central to their way of being. It wasn't just about living in nature, it was about being in agreement with it, a kind of give and take, praising it, pleading with it, even arguing with it.
It's a completely different way of existing, and I think that helps explain why this fascination with influencing the mind, it's never really gone away, has it?
It really hasn't. And in some ways, mass media has only amplified it. People are worried about how their minds might be influenced, often without even realizing it.
And of course, the study of hypnosis, the hypnotic state, that really changed things. It sort of brought these ancient ideas into the realm of science. And that, of course, caught the attention of certain organizations, right?
Oh, absolutely. Intelligence agencies were very interested in this stuff. And that's where things start to get, well, a little bit darker.
Yeah, the involvement of intelligence agencies definitely marks a turning point. We see some really disturbing stuff happening in the 20th century.
The experiments carried out by the SS in concentration camps, for example, using suggestion, drugs, physical torture, all to try and control people's minds. It's horrific.
Absolutely horrific. And then there's this Soviet secret neuroenergetics laboratory in the 1920s, funded by the OGPU. It operated in complete secrecy for 12 years.
It's fascinating, but also really troubling, the lengths they were willing to go to.
Mm-hmm.
Gleb Boki, the head of the OGPU Special Department, he even wanted to send an expedition to Tibet to learn ancient secrets about telepathy and parapsychology.
Can you imagine? They were so serious about this stuff that they were willing to send Yakov Blumkin, a notorious figure, to lead the expedition.
Right. And even though that official expedition didn't happen, Blumkin ended up infiltrating Nicholas Rorick's expedition instead. They were determined to uncover those secrets no matter what.
And the research they were doing in that neuroenergetics lab was all over the place. They were building radio espionage devices, studying solar activity, Earth's magnetism, even UFOs.
It's like Boki saw the world as this giant information system, waiting to be tapped into by manipulating the human mind. He thought they could get secret, intimate information that way.
Their goal was incredibly ambitious. They wanted to read thoughts telepathically, extract information from the brain just by looking at a photo or even thinking about someone, all while the person was in an altered state of consciousness, of course.
You know, those psychotechniques, they actually go way back, even before Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
But they were banned in the 16th century by the Council of Trent. They thought it was the devil's work.
Wow. But, I mean, even in the lives of saints, there were stories about clairvoyance. So obviously this stuff has been around for a long time. It's just been kept under wraps.
And the fact that this neuroenergetics lab was a state secret, it shows how sensitive this research was. They didn't want anyone to know about it.
It's interesting, though, how the researchers were focusing on bioelectrical phenomena like in cells, the brain, living organisms. It's like they were trying to understand these mystical abilities through science.
Yeah, a really interesting blend of the esoteric and the scientific.
Mm.
Sadly, though, the OGPU ended up cracking down on the secret society connected to this research. Boki and Barchenko, both dead.
Yeah, it's a reminder that this research was and still is very dangerous, especially if the authorities think you're getting too close to something they don't want you to know.
It's kind of ironic that Boki was later rehabilitated, though.
Uh-huh.
A little too late, unfortunately. If you're interested in learning more about this whole story, Oleg Shishkin's book, Battle for the Himalayas, NKVD Magic and Espionage, goes into a lot of detail.
We'll put a link to that in the show notes. Okay, so moving on. This research didn't just disappear, did it?
Oh, no, not at all. By the mid-20th century, the KGB, CIA, and other intelligence agencies were using what they had learned for, well, you could call it brainwashing, I guess. They were doing it to their agents and diplomats.
And this is also when we start to see electronic methods being developed to control and manipulate minds. It's a whole new level of sophistication.
Right. And this research got a huge boost during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The Americans, for example, were really interested in Pavlov's work on mind control.
And there were some pretty disturbing experiments going on in the U.S., too. At the University of California, they were doing research on how oscillating fields could affect behavior. They found that even weak fields, after just 15 minutes, could make it difficult for people to do simple tasks.
Yeah, it's kind of scary, isn't it? Even these subtle environmental factors can have an impact on our minds.
Yeah.
And that led to research into very low-frequency sound as a weapon.
Right, now this is where it gets really creepy. So they discovered that there's this natural wave channel between the ionosphere and the Earth, and it resonates at a frequency of about 8 hertz.
Which happens to be right in the range of the human brain's alpha rhythms, 7 to 12 hertz. So the idea was, could you use this to, say, disrupt industrial activity?
The idea that you could use ultrasound or very low frequency sound to make an entire country drowsy. It sounds like science fiction, but it was a real area of research.
And then you combine that with the potential for radio and television to transmit suggestions for mass hypnosis. That's a whole other level of mind control.
Yeah, that's straight out of a dystopian novel. But according to these sources, it was a serious concern.
And don't forget about the Tesla effect. That also played a role in this low-frequency research. They found that directed ELF waves could disrupt the electronic functions in the brain.
Leading to, what? Disorders of consciousness and increased suggestibility? That's terrifying.
It is pretty unsettling. But let's talk about psi technologies.
Okay, psi technologies. These are computer technologies that can be used to diagnose and regulate both mental and physical states. It's like they can tap into the subconscious mind.
There are two main processes. First, computer psychoanalysis, which uses math to analyze visual and auditory symbols. They're looking for pain points in the subconscious.
And then they use psychoregulation to try and, I guess, fix those vulnerabilities.
Exactly. But the problem is, this stuff can be misused. It could be used to create fear, aggression, even destroy someone's personality.
Yeah, it's a very powerful tool that could easily be weaponized. And it's kind of disturbing that these sources claim psychoregulation is 100% effective in advertising, even for bad products.
And the regulations in the U.S. are much stricter than in Russia, which is a little worrying. It seems like there's more potential for misuse in Russia.
So Novosibirsk, it seems like that was a hotbed for psychotronics research in Russia, right? There were a lot of scientific developments happening there in the 70s, focused on controlling the behavior of both humans and animals.
Yeah, and NPO Energy was involved too. They were working on remote influence on biological objects.
Including humans. And get this, by 1989, they had developed equipment that could apparently adjust the behavior of an entire population from orbit. We're talking about a population the size of Krasnodar-Krai.
It's hard to even fathom the scale of that.
Okay, so let's talk about microwave radiation. Specifically, the effects of specially modulated, super high-frequency electromagnetic pulses. They can really mess with your brain.
Yeah, our sources mention altered perception, trouble thinking clearly, emotional instability, even reduced learning ability, plus aggression, depression, and some really serious stuff like catatonia and catalepsy.
And it affects the peripheral nervous system, too. You can have changes in movement, convulsive
And it
reactions.
can be fatal.
Yes, potentially. Acute heart failure, brain edema. It's really dangerous stuff.
There have been several Russian research institutions studying the effects of this radiation on the brain. But there's a problem, a serious lack of funding and coordination.
Especially compared to the US, where they're spending millions of dollars every year. And even with limited resources, the Russian research suggests that low-intensity microwaves and optical range electromagnetic fields can have serious biological effects.
Like disrupting cell function and brain activity,
Right.
right? Exactly. And that can lead to all sorts of problems with higher mental functions.
It seems like the widespread use of devices that emit magnetic radiation is a huge problem. It could be affecting our genes.
That's what the sources are suggesting, yeah.
Mm.
We need more research, and we need it now. And to make matters worse, it seems like some of those zombification technologies were sold off after the Soviet Union collapsed. Who knows who has them now?
Okay, shifting gears a little bit. Let's talk about soft hypnosis and NLP.
Right. Milton Erickson, an American psychiatrist, he developed techniques for inducing hypnosis using very subtle cues, things like touch, eye movements, sounds, smells.
And the U.S. intelligence agencies were supporting this research.
We were, yeah. And Mikhail Chekhov, Anton Chekhov's nephew, he actually brought some of these techniques to California back in 1932.
It's interesting how both intelligence agencies and, sorcerers and shamans use these psychotechniques. It's like they're all trying to access the same part of the mind.
Exactly. But it's not without risks. All these devices that operate at the level of the field, they can have negative effects on people. And some of the tests, well, they can be really destructive.
There's that example of Ilona Davidova's English language system, right? The one that supposedly left a trace of a foreign consciousness in people's minds.
Yeah, people were complaining of nervousness, insomnia, aggression, and this feeling of something alien inside them. It's pretty disturbing.
Definitely. We need to be very careful with this stuff.
Ugh.
A humanistic approach is absolutely essential, and we need more transparency in research. Oh, and there's this thing called zapping. It's the influence of electromagnetic fields from everyday devices.
Right, like your phone, your computer, all that stuff. And then there's the possibility of transmitting information electronically, like through thought or eye contact. It's like sending wishes and energy.
And they think we might be able to read information from each other, too, through a weak quantum connection between objects. That could explain why we feel connected to certain people, animals, or even objects.
It's a fascinating idea. But it's important to remember that remote influence is still very unreliable. The results can vary depending on the day, the time, the location, the people involved. It's not an exact science.
Okay, let's talk about these global experiments. They were trying to figure out how consistently people could perceive distant image-based communications.
Yeah, they were looking at all sorts of factors, like cosmic and prenatal conditions, regional differences, and even the role of telecommunications in shaping Earth's information field.
So they had people choose images from a set, sometimes freely, sometimes with guidance, and then describe what they were seeing.
Right. Researchers like Kazanachev, Trofanov, and others were really important in developing these experimental methods.
And they were trying to connect the accuracy of the perceptions to things like the participants' prenatal environment and the level of solar activity at the time.
Yeah, they found that people who developed in the womb during periods of high solar activity seemed to be better at receiving information this way.
That's wild. They also looked at the season of birth and even zodiac signs, but those results weren't as clear.
It's really interesting, though, the idea that our biological development could be linked to our sensitivity to these external influences. And then you have John Cunningham Lilly and his work with sensory deprivation tanks.
Oh, yeah, those tanks filled with warm salt water, sometimes with LSD, too.
The goal was to induce altered states of consciousness, to access and explore the unconscious mind. It's another way of trying to understand and influence consciousness by changing the sensory input.
Okay, now for the less fun part. Altered states of consciousness can be used for some pretty bad stuff.
Unfortunately, yes. Our sources say that negative emotions like aggression can be amplified, just like positive emotions can be weakened. That can lead to all sorts of problems like civil wars, mass unrest, even collective suicides.
It's the dark side of mind control. And psi technologies, those can be used for political purposes, too.
Yeah, it's like a continuation of the use of force, but in a more subtle, psychological way, especially when things like weapons of mass destruction are off the table.
So instead of physical force, we have intellectual attacks. targeting leaders, the military, even the general population.
Zbigniew Brzezinski, he actually wrote about the political importance of mind control back in the 70s. He talked about how communication could be used to control emotions and motivations.
So this has been on people's radar for a while, and they've developed all sorts of ways to influence people, haven't they? Acoustic, visible light, infrared, ultraviolet, radio waves, even computer viruses designed to mess with your mind.
And then there are bioresonance systems, which can be used to manipulate the brain and nervous system. They can induce specific excited states in people.
So it seems like mind control has gone from being a fringe idea to something that's being actively researched and developed by governments around the world.
That's right. And Walter Bollard, in his book about U.S. intelligence agencies, he asks a really important question. Should this knowledge be controlled by a select few, or should it be used to benefit everyone?
It's a question we should all be asking ourselves. Okay, let's talk about brainwashing. It's something we've all heard about, especially in the context of the Cold War.
Right. The Manchurian Candidate really cemented that image of brainwashing in the public consciousness. Isolation, deprivation, torture, psychological manipulation, all to break someone's will.
And we see echoes of that in real life with reports of U.S. torture practices in Iraq and those secret flying prisons. It's terrifying to think that this stuff actually happens.
And those mind control methods in the Manchurian Candidate, they weren't just made up. They were based on real techniques.
So people were actually programmed using hypnosis to become assassins, spies, couriers, and they used post-hypnotic triggers and amnesia to cover their tracks.
Exactly. And it wasn't just limited to a few individuals. American soldiers returning from Vietnam were subjected to processing before they were discharged.
They were using drugs, behavior modification, conditioning, all sorts of methods to erase or minimize their memories of the war. It's just horrifying.
Walter Bollard claims that there's evidence of mind control efforts going back decades, even centuries. The church and the state have always been interested in controlling people's beliefs and actions.
It's like this urge to control is built into our systems of power. And looking to the future, Alvin Toffler predicted that the industry of impressions and sensations would become a major part of our economy.
Yeah, he talked about psycho corporations selling pre-programmed experiences. It's a pretty bleak vision of the future where our very experiences are commodified.
And there's that story about the 1971 Buenos Aires Congress, where U.S. scientists were discussing using drugs to control rebellious students.
The U.S. military has been experimenting with drugs and hypnosis since World War II. The OSS started it, and then the CIA took over with a massive secret program focused on behavior modification.
And a 1949 Rand Corporation memo proposed using drugs to cause memory loss and even electroshock therapy to disrupt memories. It's unbelievable how many hospitals and universities were involved in this research.
It was a huge secret network.
Yeah.
And it's important to understand that the whole brainwashing narrative was partly a propaganda tool used by the U.S. government.
Right. It was a way to demonize the communists, cover up their own confusion about betrayals, and justify some pretty unethical experiments.
And the term brainwashing really took off after the Soviet Union accused the U.S. of using bacteriological weapons in Korea. Even though some of the testimonies were later recanted, the damage was done.
It's like this whole idea of brainwashing became a way to dismiss anyone who disagreed with the U.S. government. Okay, there's this interesting discussion in our sources about the concept of will.
Yeah, it's something that theologians have been debating for centuries, but modern psychology doesn't really deal with it that much anymore. It's too abstract.
But it's a crucial question, isn't it? Can people be forced to act against their will? Can hypnosis actually change someone's moral compass?
The sources argue that in a normal state, people can't be forced to go against their beliefs. But hypnosis can alter your perceptions. It can make a friend seem like an enemy, leading you to do things you wouldn't normally do.
And then you have the guilt and the pangs of conscience afterwards, showing that there's a disconnect between what you did and what you wanted to do. It really raises some deep questions about free will.
That Rand Corporation report from 1949 highlighted the ethical and political implications of hypnosis research. They talked about Soviet experiments from the 1920s that induced guilt and false confessions, and Luria's research on hypnosis-induced crimes in the 1930s.
And they even proposed using hypnotic suggestion to get false confessions from defendants. They thought they could manipulate people's guilt and then use post-hypnotic suggestions to make them enter a hypnotic sleep on cue. It would make the confession seem totally believable.
They also talked about using electroshock to induce convulsions. It would temporarily impair mental function, cause memory loss, and weaken the sense of self. They thought it could be useful for people who were resistant to hypnosis.
So all of these techniques, narcohypnosis, electroshock, they were all being developed to essentially turn people into zombies who would obey the government without question.
And they could use it to carry out secret, dirty orders, bypassing any constitutional protections. The person might not even be aware of what they're doing, or they might have amnesia afterwards.
It's chilling. And they were using drugs and hypnosis during interrogations, too. They'd try to revive past events and then induce amnesia afterwards so the person wouldn't remember the interrogation.
Project Artichoke became MKUltra, which was a CIA cover for all sorts of secret projects. MK Delta was specifically for the use of biochemicals in covert operations.
Yeah.
It was all very compartmentalized and shrouded in secrecy.
And the Navy was heavily involved in this research, too. They were analyzing and synthesizing narcotics for mind control at Bethesda Naval Hospital for years.
Wow.
They had a project called lie detection at Indiana University, where they were studying how people's psychology changes when they lie.
And at Rochester University, they were studying the effects of drugs on the vestibular system. They wanted to create side effects that could be used for mind control. It was a massive effort across multiple branches of the military.
And the Air Force was funding LSD experiments on animals at the University of Minnesota. They were using electroshock, too, for interrogation and to induce amnesia.
The CIA was really focused on using hypnosis for mind control. They wanted to see how far they could push it.
All of this research, the drugs, the behavior modification, it was being used in prisons and mental institutions, too. It led to a wave of lawsuits in the 60s and a Senate investigation in the 70s.
And by the time the CIA admitted to some of these activities, there were tons of behavior modification programs already running across different government departments.
It was a huge, sprawling network. And it's important to remember that psychological warfare became a major part of war during World War II. With radio, they could spread propaganda to entire nations at once.
It was a powerful new weapon, and it's still being developed today. The U.S. is still researching psi-influence, drawing on Eastern psychophysical systems, hypnosis, NLP, psychostimulation, computer technologies, and bioresonance stimulation.
It's all about controlling behavior. And there are even rumors that they're using these techniques on leaders of other countries.
Israel is focusing on self-regulation, altered consciousness, and physical potential. They're also developing tech for behavior programming based on Kabbalah.
Japan's military is researching parapsychological phenomena for intelligence gathering. They're making good progress in developing new ways to achieve altered states of consciousness and to influence people remotely.
North Korea's intelligence agencies are experimenting with ways to disrupt organ function and even kill people using these techniques. And in Spain, they're researching how to disrupt brain function and alter the psyche.
Germany has a huge parapsychological society that's been collecting information on people with special abilities. And there are reports of energy informational influence being used on individuals and groups in multiple countries.
It's clear that this research is happening all over the world.
Okay, let's talk about the psychophysical operator training that's happening in Russia. They're training people to do some pretty incredible things.
Yeah, like identifying hidden threats, making forecasts, geolocation, reading subconscious information from photos and documents, health diagnostics, assessing specialist readiness, even predicting natural disasters and finding resources.
It's like they're trying to develop psychic spies.
In a way, yeah. And they have a very specific process for training these operators. It starts with initiation, which is about learning to participate in collective psychophysical action.
They're trying to achieve altered states of consciousness that allow them to influence the external world.
Right, it's about bridging the mental and the physical. And then there's universalization, which is about identifying with the collective and prioritizing the group over the individual. It supposedly gives you access to different dimensions of space and time.
So they think they can tap into this collective consciousness that's more powerful than any individual. And then there's individuation, which is about self-awareness and self-control.
It's essential for managing the power they gain through the other two stages. It's about inner balance.
So initiation changes your psychic status, universalization changes your external status, and individuation is about maintaining your internal balance.
Exactly. And the biggest problem for these operators is indifference. If they're not passionate about their work, it won't work. They need to be part of a collective with strong energetic protection.
The collective protects them from the reverse effects of their actions. And they're very careful about who they let into these groups. They're looking for people with life experience, investigative drive, a willingness to learn, and a flexible mind.
And they need a good education, too. Humanities, philosophy, telosophy, and specific psychophysical techniques. It takes years of training.
Wow, so joining one of these collectives really changes you, both physically and mentally.
It does. And it can even affect the people around you. If they're not on board with this change, it can create tension.
Because you're basically radiating this different energy.
That's right. And it's important to remember that these operators are always working as part of a collective. They're protected from the backlash by the group and by a special generator.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about these mind control programs, these technologies, these techniques. But how does it actually work? What's going on in the brain when someone is being influenced?
Well, one way to think about it is to imagine a human as a kind of computer. We have an operating system, and we're constantly loading new programs through education, experiences, and our interactions with the world.
Okay, I can see that. But how does that relate to mind control?
Well, just like a computer, our operating system is vulnerable to viruses. These viruses can bypass our natural defenses, causing malfunctions in our thinking and leading to illogical behavior.
So you're saying that mind control is like a virus that infects our brains.
In a way, yes. These viruses can come from individuals, and then they spread, looking for a way to enter our consciousness.
And how do they do that?
Well, think of our consciousness as a kind of decoder or translator between the external world and our internal world. It's like a filter that protects us from harmful information. But sometimes that filter can be weakened.
When we're stressed, tired, emotional.
Exactly. And that's when these viruses can slip in. They can even enter our subconscious during sleep, gradually weakening our defenses.
Okay, so what are these viruses? Are you talking about ideas, beliefs, emotions?
All the above. Words are like codes that program our reality. If the world is a virtual game, then prayer is like a code that launches or blocks certain applications.
So what you're saying is that everything we experience, everything we see and hear, has the potential to influence us.
Yes. And some things are more effective at bypassing our defenses than others. For example, modern cinema, with its special effects and visual storytelling, can be very persuasive. It can shut down our critical thinking and make us more susceptible to suggestion.
So we're all vulnerable to mind control.
To some extent, yes. But some people are more vulnerable than others. People who are easily influenced, who lack critical thinking skills, they're like open doors for these viruses.
Okay, so how do we protect ourselves?
The best defense is to be aware of these influences, to question everything, and to strengthen our own minds. Be honest with yourself. Don't ignore your intuition.
So it's about being mindful and critical.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to question what you see and hear, even if it comes from a source you trust.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the history of mind control, the different techniques that are being used, and the potential dangers. But what does it all mean? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that we need to be aware of the power of the mind and the potential for its manipulation. We need to be critical thinkers, to question everything, and to protect our own minds.
And we need to have an open and honest conversation about these technologies and how they're being used. The more we know, the better equipped we'll be to protect ourselves.
Absolutely. And I think we also need to be mindful of the ethical implications of these technologies. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should.
That's a great point. We need to be very careful about how we develop and use these technologies. Okay, deep divers, that's all the time we have for today.